Hello, everyone. Welcome to Coffee Chat with Holistic Dog Professionals. Hi, everyone. Look who we have here Emma, Marco. Well, me too, kind of, sort of. How you guys doing?
I'm fine.
So, we have a very
Wonderful,
interesting
wonderful.
we have a very interesting chapter today to talk about. Are you feeding your dog into aggression? And I know it sounds weird because it doesn't make any sense for most people, but from my experience, and I'm sure Emma and Marco are the same on the same side, we have seen a lot of aggression because of food. So let's talk about a little bit about your experience with food related aggression. I'm not talking food aggression, okay? Food aggression and food related aggression are two different things. So what do you guys have experience with? Emma, how about you start?
I don't know. I'm just thinking of my most recent cases. And one of my friends has taken on a young dog who's 9 months old, and it is food related, but it's also food aggression. But it's related to other things as well. And because he's got congenital vestibular disorder, he was put on a medication that increased his appetite to such an extent that then he was resource guarding food, but he was also showing lots of other behaviours as well, including diarrhea and stomach upsets and lots of behaviours related to that. So that's my most recent. But from my own experience, one of my little dogs, she also, I've been thinking, sometimes I think if dogs have got issues with food, they become food guarders, don't they? So the two things are intertwined. She had been, she came to me because she'd bitten a child who'd taken food from her. But towards the end of her life, she got a little bit more grumpy, and that was all food related because she had health issues that were underpinning appetence, and she wasn't interested in food, but she didn't want anyone else to eat her food, and she was just kind of, not feeling at her best because she was not as hungry as she should be. So really, from a personal and a professional level.
Emma, tell me a little bit about you're in France and you're a shelter behaviorist in France. Tell me a little bit about the shelter. What is your type of intakes you guys get?
We're open access and we're urban rural, so we're in the middle of the countryside, but we're also next to a really big town. So we get urban dogs like your pit bulls and your mixed race kind of dogs that are status dogs and so on. And we get a lot of guard dogs, working dogs, utility dogs, hunting dogs, right the way through. Terriers that are used to working, Dachshunds that are used to working and going, down holes trying to trap badgers and things like this. We get the whole range of dogs from a whole range of experiences. And because we're open access, and we're not to brag, but we are really good at rehoming. So people ask for us to take on their dogs who've got problems because they know that we're not going to euthanize them, and because we've got a good success rate. So that's really our shelter. But most of my work at the moment is not in the shelter because so many other people from other associations have got problems with dogs. So not so much there at the moment as normal.
So thank you so much. So for those who just jumped in, we're talking about food, about aggression that stems from feeding and food related causes. And we're going to cause about 8 points that we want to discuss today. Marco, tell a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm particularly focused on free-ranging dogs and family dogs, also dogs living as a pet companion, and in the particular regard of food, feeding, eating, and aggression, I can both. I could talk about both two contexts, basically. The context of dog behavior consultation, so meaning the context, all of those events, food related, that happen between dogs and human within a family home, within a family context, which is let's say 40-50% of my intervention as a dog behavior consultant are related to food, not necessarily as a primary problem, but is part of the picture, is often part of the picture. Maybe because of the background of the dog, and the dog has been traumatized around food, or because, or it may be because the people that are feeding the dog get agitated or do something that may be improved during that moment, and we can expand on that. So this is the family context. The other context is the free-ranging dogs context, uh, 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 of which I am very passionate about.
Yeah.
I'm very passionate about this context, and um, in this case, I have to say, free-ranging dogs cope very well with managing resources if they are by themselves. But when human interact with them, being local people living around free-ranging dogs, or often when feeders, caretakers, organizations, associations step into the picture and trying to feed for animal welfare purposes, trying to feed the dogs in the street, that's the moment where dogs start generating fights that they haven't generated before, right? So food clearly is a very critical topic, both in domestic contexts and on the streets, on the beaches, and with free-ranging dogs. So we can also go more realms, right?
Awesome. I super appreciate your input here. A side note, you're breaking up a little bit on the side, but you're coming still over at some point. So,
Okay.
my experience with dog food related aggression, I started as a behaviorist with national rescues in the East Coast, and I've seen dogs who come in from shelters come in with severe aggression in different areas, usually food aggression, resource guarding, and aggression that stem from health related. And as Emma mentioned before, um, due to health conditions, the dogs would not be able to do proper intake, or working on his nutrition intake. And the first thing that I recognize is, as soon as we start by protocol working with either online or with in-person clients, the first thing I change is increasing and improving the quality of dog food, as of um, using that as also incentive to bond between human and animal. The animal dogs are so self body aware. They are, um, let's say, they can smell and they can understand what they need in the environment. So um, zoopharmacology is a classical example where the animal can actually choose its own nutrients to eat and get healthy. However, in that case, with our restrictions in food, these things declined. So we have also the vaccinations that come to the equation that causes digestive issues, and the dogs will not be able to do the intake. And the third thing that's going to happen if a dog goes in the shelter, he's getting boosters over the boosters, the existing ones. There's stress involved. There is low quality food involved because it's as cheap as possible, so the shelter can afford to feed so many dogs. And some shelters have 10, 15 dogs. Some other shelters have 100 and 200 dogs and even more. We have to be very, very clearly, it's not their fault for not being able to feed healthy, but there are restrictions, financial restrictions. So if we get one dog out of that shelter, the first thing we've been confronted is the dog is nutritional hungry and is in nutritional and organ distress. And the first thing to do is to calm the dog down, help him with nutritional intake. And usually the dog gets out of that survival mode he's in. And I think you both will agree, if a dog is in a shelter, he's in constantly survival mode. And the moment he gets out, the whole thing basically calms down, which helps the dog kind of recognize his environment. And of course, if there is a food source, he will guard it because he's in survival mode. And I see many fosters who take dogs in and they kind of cute and they forget about that aspect of this survival mode where the dog comes into their home. And of course, for example, if we have, like with Marco, free roaming dogs, and there is a human intervention, that dynamic is changed. So the status quo of the group mentality of those animals, I don't want to use the term pack here, the group mentality of animals changes because of human intervention. We have competition coming in because of that food, correct, Marco?
Yes, and an important, a very critical aspect in that scenario is that the space and the distribution of dogs changed. So when you have free dogs spread around a territory, let's say a neighbor, right? And there are 2 or 3 free-ranging dogs over here, and then other free-ranging dogs over there, and then another 2 free-ranging dogs over there. So they are distributed in a certain rate around that territory, right? But when you create a feeding spot, you change all the organization of those dogs within that territory. So the space changes, the rules based on that space change, and dogs get very nervous because of that. So when we go and very competitive as a consequence also to access that food resources, right? Of course, when we zoom into a shelter, we have the shelter is already that situation, right? That set up, right? Because this is very difficult to create that distance, that space organization within a shelter. If you have right? But so free-ranging dogs manage that freely. In a shelter, you need to create a lot of measures and restrictions because there are dogs. I hope you can confirm that dogs that cannot meet other dogs and then have different rhythm. That dog can go just with that volunteer, and that other dog can go just with those other people. You know, you have already all of those stressful elements, right? In addition to that, you have a place where they are put together somehow, being this a little shelter or a larger shelter, that creates already what we would observe out there in the street when a feeders goes there, put the food just in one spot, and all the dogs come from different direction, and all the rules, space-related rules, go upside down, right? So I believe that this would be an interesting aspect to discuss when we talk about shelters in particular, and taking the lesson of what happened on the street, of course, in that regard.
Awesome. So I see, Emma, you have
I
something.
was just going to say, from our perspective, one of our main budget issues is it's as expensive as vaccinations and healthcare is food, and we have a specialist shelter food for the dogs, so it's higher in fats than it is than normal dog foods are, and better quality proteins. I mean, it's not perfect, but a lot of the dogs still have persistent diarrhea related to that and so on because it is stressful. But I think it depends on the dog, because a lot of ours come from living outside, and a lot of them come from, they are bred to work as group. So we've got a lot of Anglo-Fronte hounds, we've got a lot of Bruno de Jura, we've got a lot of very traditional hounds that work as a pack. Sorry to use that word, but they work as a group of 12 or 13 dogs when they're out hunting, and they live together. Yep. And the guys, when they go in to feed them, they take in a big, massive, great big sack, or sometimes even a wild boar, and just throw it in, and the dogs sort it out themselves. But because of the etiquette of breeding, and because they've had, 700-800 years of being selectively bred for cooperative behaviours in a group, they're different than if you did that with a group of terriers and you threw a pack of bones into a group of terriers, and the consequences of that. So it depends, I think, very much on the dog. And on the shelter. So we have our dogs managed in small groups. So there, some dogs are single dogs because that's what they want. But if possible, we have them in with other dogs. And it's the only time that we separate the dogs during the day is just for feeding times. And then we put them back together again. So there are ways that you can manage it. But I would agree that the dogs are not getting the nutrients that they need, even if you give them really good food, because they're in a stressful environment and because their sympathetic nervous system is constantly engaged. And so they're just not digesting things in the way that they should be. So you could give them the best food in the world, and because of the environment, for some of the dogs, not all of them, because some of the dogs, it's like they've landed in Club Med when they get to our shelter, because they've never known a life like that before, and they've never had good quality food. For instance, we had one of our adopters, she phoned to say that the dog was having problems eating. And I knew where the dog had come from. And I said, have you tried using pasta? Because the dog had been brought up on a pasta and bread diet, and that's what the dog had eaten. And the dog, when it got dog biscuits and meat and things, much higher value food, didn't know what to do with it or how to eat it. So I think very much from a shelter perspective, it depends on the dog, and it depends on the life that they've come from. And it depends also on the breed of the dog and how they've lived in their life experiences so far, because you get a group of hounds and they're much less likely to fight over the food than a group of, say, for instance, if you had all the German Shepherds together, they would, I don't know what would happen in those circumstances. So I think that very much depends, but you're right that the environment itself, for a lot of dogs, if they're in sort of fight or flight mode most of the day, aren't even going to be taking on the nutrients that are available to them, even if you give them a really good food.
Good. You guys have awesome input. So this is what I think we should do for our audience. Let's put it in a list. Let's start with feeding schedule. How can feeding schedule improve aggression in the shelter, for example?
When you say improve, you mean how does it reduce aggression? How can it reduce aggression?
Yes.
So the feeding schedule in itself, of course, because they're fed on a rhythm, the dogs know when it's feeding time. So it can be necessary to separate the dogs quite a long time before feeding, simply because they're aroused because the bowls are going round. And because we've got 200 dogs in our kennel, so we also need to be conscious of the order in which we're feeding dogs. And there are certain dogs that will get fed first, simply because they've got health needs that mean that they can't be engaged in some kind of stressful response and then eat. So, for instance, dogs who are at risk for gastric torsion or any other health problems like that, dogs who are hypoglycemic, the last thing that we want is to put them in a state of stress for 20 minutes while we're handing out all the other bowls around the shelter and then give them their food afterwards. So those kind of things are important. Not on a health, not necessarily on an aggression aspect, but certainly for dogs who are a high risk of gastric torsion or have trouble in those kind of ways, I think it's really important. They are fed, as you said somewhere else, I think, Rowan, they're fed, several times during the day. So that can help. I mean, we also have to have rules about not feeding the dogs from hand if there are other dogs there, and know a bit of their history. I mean, we use food quite a lot, which is quite rare in France. I think we're one of the rare shelters where, we distribute food quite freely. But we have to be conscious that in itself can cause aggression, that if there are two dogs together, that's going to cause excitement and tensions as well beforehand. I don't know if that's answered your question or not.
Yep, sure. Marco, how do you see free-roaming dogs organize their feeding schedule? How many times do you usually eat? Do they have a distinction between puppies and adult dogs? Who eats first?
Well, it depends. It depends on the how a few dogs aggregate, right? In general, what I have seen until a certain age, let's say until to answer your question, until 4 months old, a puppy is around 4 months old. The adult dog are very permissive to them, but then they start to be a bit more harsh, yeah, and which makes sense, because in that environment, a dog that starts to have 5 months, 6 months needs to find needs to be able to find the resources by himself or herself to survive, right? Which very likely may mean to just associate with the house, for example, with the bar, with the restaurant, with an hotel, right? So when you are working for a restaurant, and all of a sudden this 5 months old puppy shows up outside the door, and you say, what where these cute guys come from? Let's give him some food, right?
Yeah.
So until a few days ago, that dog was living, if it was lucky enough to be left in peace with the mom or with other conspecifics, was living with other dogs, maybe in a more secluded area or a little bit away from a main road, for example. But then, because at that age, the competition, let's say, from among between adult and puppies start to increase, then those puppies are pushed somehow to go away and search for other sources of food, right? And the feeding schedule, as you can imagine, is it's, let's say, is conditioned, so to speak, by the feeding schedule of people and on the environment that those dogs live in, right? So, for example, in the case of Bali, one important feeding moment for Bali dogs, free-ranging Bali dogs, is early in the morning, because early in the morning, the Balinese go out and make ceremonies, and with these ceremonies, they make some offerings all around the houses, and they put some rice, some little offerings with the rice and biscuits and a little piece of chicken sometime. So the dogs at that time of the day go have their breakfast basically based on the ceremony and the offerings that the people are doing. And then another important moment is after lunch, around lunchtime, because people go to eat and throw something away from a restaurant and something like that. So dogs tend to go to aggregate around those places where humans are aggregating for eating and to catch something. And another important one, of course, is in the night, is late evening, when those activities, restaurants, hotel, and so on, close, and they bring the garbage outside. And so dogs can go scavenge around those areas. We are talking about, in this case, we are talking about fully free-ranging dogs, dogs that do not particularly associate with the family, with the house. Of course, if there is a free-ranging dogs that associate with the family, probably within that family, people will feed the dog. So the dog goes there, eat, and goes to free range again on the beach, on the forest,
Supplementing.
free, yeah, supplementing, getting some snack here and there if it happens. Otherwise, in the evening, dinner time, he shows up at home, and those people eat and give food to the dog, and the dog leaves again, and so on, right? So it really depends on the lifestyle of the dog.
So we can say that we have a feeding schedule that, starting with the puppies, 4 times a day for puppies until 3 months. Then we go down to 3 months, 3 times feeding per 3 or 6 months, and then we go down to 2 times a day for elder dogs than 6 months. However, dogs adjust to the feeding schedule of the individual family and the individual location. If they're free roaming, they're going home, get the regular menu, and then they go chatting, snacking, whatever needs supplementary for free roaming dogs. While in the shelter, we cannot barely feed 4 times a day, so we have specific cases where the senior dogs are fed according to their needs, puppies are feeding according to their needs, and then we have the regular dogs maintenance feeding routines, usually twice a day, right? So the next thing I would like to look for is, let me get rid of that one. Our next step would be feeding amount, which we just increased. How much food should a dog take? What do you guys think of the amount? Because I see many people says, oh, I'm feeding my dog 4 times a day. And I ask him, okay, how much food do you give him? Well, I'm reading the ingredients on the list. And I said, well, if a puppy is, you have to add 1.3 times the amount recommended. And if the dog is lactating, then you have to add more to that, because you're feeding the mommy and you're feeding the puppy at the same time. However, senior dogs have a different amount, being able to eat differently because they don't have so much exercise going on. Too much food causes obesity, not enough food causes stress. So how do you guys regulate that in a shelter, and how do dogs regulate that in freedom?
I guess they regulate it because we regulate it. So I don't know. I used to feed, my dogs could help themselves, and they actually maintained a healthy weight when they did. But I don't think their food was particularly appetizing, maybe. So I know dogs who are perfectly healthy and who do, free feed. But for my dogs, it's basically, do you look a little porky? If you look a bit porky, then I'm going to reduce your food a little bit. And if you're looking a little bit thin, then I'm going to add a little bit. But I think there are cultural issues at work as well, because I think there are different perspectives. Certainly, I've seen dogs that I think consider a healthy weight, and people in Anglo-Saxon countries are more likely to think their dog is underweight. So I think that's a perception as well, that a little bit of hip and rib for me is not necessarily a bad thing. But I guess it just depends on the dog, doesn't it?
I totally agree. How does it look like with free roaming dogs? How much do they grab whatever they can and then like sunbathing around that, or do they spread out, digging, hiding their food to get it later?
Well, in some rare case, they may hide the food, but there is very little chance that that food is not found by somebody else, right? So I honestly have been observing that more in dogs that live in a domestic context, but maybe that family has a backyard, right? So the dog can still express that type of behavior. But free-ranging dogs may tend to consume what they find at the moment, right? And what I have learned, probably the most important lesson that I've learned from free-ranging dogs in this particular regard is that, as you can imagine, the amount that they eat is always variable, is never the same amount. So one day they can eat, let's say, of their 100% intake of that day, 20% in the morning, 5% 2 hours later, 55% in the afternoon, and another 25% in the evening, for example. And the other day, the day after, the proportion change again, right? Unless they associate with the house, because we need to remind that a good part of free-ranging dogs also associate with the house, with the family. They're not restricted, but they associate anyway with the house, with the restaurant. So they have a sort of food granted every day, granted, so to speak. So in that case, that may be a bit more regular as amount, every portion, let's say, that they get, right? But basically, the amount that they get is always variable. And I have applied that also as a dog behavior consultant when I support some clients and they ask, okay, how much time I should feed the dog, and the board that you showed a moment before, I totally agree with that. And I also try to suggest, consistently with what I said, consistently with what I learned from free-ranging dogs, to not provide always the same amount of food. Let's say if you have that 100% of food intake that you want to give to your dog, and you are feeding your dog 2 times per day, give 30 one time and 70 the other time. And don't be also precise every time. Don't put things on the weight and always do 30 and 70. You know, the day after, you can make 35 and 65, and then 25 and 75, whatever, right? Try to be a bit variable, because that not just mirrors a more natural behavior of, as have been observed in free-ranging dogs, but and it makes sense because the also the dogs is exposed, the stomach of the dog is exposed to different degree of work, right? So it doesn't get just set in one way, but is exposed to different type of labor, right? So needs to process a little bit less, needs to process a little bit more, and that variability supports also the wealth and the health, the well-being of a dog, right? So, of course, that's not always possible. Sometimes I'm sure in shelters, maybe sometimes things need to be set a bit more precisely to keep a schedule. And I don't know, maybe you can say something in that particular regard, Emma.
Yeah, I was just nodding away there. I'm just interested by the whole concept that what we've done basically is shaped dogs, even if they're free-ranging dogs and they don't have very much contact with humans. We've shaped them to our feeding patterns and also to the things that we eat as well, which is interesting. And they've shaped us a little bit, haven't they, with their carnivore habits,
Yeah.
giving us access to a wider meat diet than we would ever have had before. So yeah, I was just kind of nodding along, really, I think. And then I was just thinking about my dogs as well at home, and the dogs that I train quite often are having to reduce a little bit of food because my dogs, that very much, it depends on what they're doing during the day, you know, and what I'm doing during the day, that they're probably going to get a little bit extra. You know, if my dog starts barking down the garden, I tell him thank you. He might come back for a little bit of an extra snack. So I think I'm just conscious that probably my dogs get more than they should, so the bowl feeding is quite minimal, and we do quite a lot of foraging as well.
One thing that I recognize with my dogs, I use feeding as enrichment. So sometimes I'm feeding a little bit more, sometimes I'm feeding a little bit less. Sometimes I skip a meal, for example. So we had a low day, it was raining, coming in with a concept, you know what, in the rainy days, no bunnies are running around, so hunting will be difficult. So how about you chill out, guys, and let's have some dinner tomorrow morning with some additives. So I do shift and change the amount throughout the day. I'm not really going according to my measure cup, but I do check with the weight once a month. So little bit up, little bit down. Um, Skipping is something that I usually do at least once a month, kind of like a short refreshing on the idea that, okay, looking forward to food, chilling out a little bit, calming the system down a little bit. I do add supplements, but we're going to talk about that a little bit in our next chapter. So looking into the quality of ingredients will be the next. What do dogs eat naturally?
Well, I had a little cocker spaniel who opened a bin bag that had been there for 3 weeks that had got some lamb's kidney in there that had been in the freezer for about 3 years, and she ate that. So I'm pretty sure, you know, anything goes when you're a cocker spaniel. And that brings us into something as well. We've got dogs, for instance, Labradors and so on, that we've already found, you know, genetic markers and so on, that means that they've got alterations in the way that they process food and the way that they eat. So I think, you know, it's quite different to have a mixed breed, kind of more of a everything goes kind of a dog, compared to some of our pedigree dogs that have certainly got cocker spaniels, for instance. I don't even have to say to my vet what breed the dog is when I call him up to say the dog's got food problems, because the first thing he'll ask is it a spaniel? You know, so I think that's something as well that plays a part that we need to think about when we think about food, is the breed of the dog. I think two of mine are just average mutts, and the other is pedigree, and there's no difference between the two there, between the two groups. So I think that's a factor as well that we need to consider, about the breed needs as well, if you like.
Marco, what did you see on your research?
Well, probably the most interesting aspect is the amount to notice the amount of starch that free-ranging dogs eat. But really, that really depends on the community, on the human community that surrounds the dog, right? Because of course, as we were saying, free-ranging dogs interact with people, and they are, let's say, they're not fully carnivore. They're not. They are scavenger carnivore, right? So they are carnivore,
opportunistic scavenging predators.
Yeah, right. So
kind of a bit like us, really.
of course, when I was in Mexico observing foraging dogs in Guanajuato, for example, there is an interesting area of Mexico where dogs live on the roofs of houses. That's where they
Sure.
are. Yeah, it's hard, it's hot, and it's a social issue, an animal welfare issue, let's say, or case at least, because in there are organizations that are active in trying to promote education and understand and help people understanding that dogs needs water. For example, we're at that level. They live on the roofs and they don't even have a bowls to drink, right? So they migrate from roof to roof. Basically, it's like to be in a free territory, but it's roof to roof, right? It's a very interesting situation. But for example, I've seen those dogs fed by how you call this quesadilla, this bread, round bread that you used to put some meat or salads inside, right? Is a round flat bread in
Yeah.
Mexico that people love. Is a staple bread for the community, right? And I seen just people feeding their dogs by throwing quesadilla on the top of a roof, right? And it wasn't a case. It wasn't just one case. You know, I've seen in that particular area of Mexico, in that village, that people often feed the dog that way. So we need to suspend any judgment, of course, on on why they do that and so on. We staying focused on what those dogs are eating, right? So that's an example of how those dogs eat those quesadillas, and which are basically starch, but I'm sure they have preferences for those quesadillas that have some chicken broth inside, because those quesadillas, at a certain point, I was observing that, and I was going to different places to search for those quesadillas and see what's inside. Right? Of course, the majority is water and other flour and a bit of other preservatives, and in some cases there is chicken broth that give a taste to it, right? And many people too prefer that quesadilla with some chicken broth than the plain one, right? So and so it's very interesting how dogs mirror the preference of human in that community, especially when they don't have a full freedom to go to search for other sources, even though they are free roaming. In this case, free roaming roof dogs, right? In the case of Bali dogs, for example, an important part of their diet is rice, white rice, because that's what they eat over there. What in Indonesia, the staple food is rice. In Bali, in particular, is a rice cultivation hotspot for Indonesia. Is a very important place where rice is produced, and dogs eat rice since thousands of years over there. So they also have adapted to that type of diet. To which degree we don't know. To which degree they benefit from it at a biological level, we don't know, because no studies have been done in that particular case, in that particular aspect. But certainly they have adapted because they've been thriving on that type of staple food, right? That comes from human, right?
I think the same is true for dogs who live, not necessarily dogs who live in the home, but dogs who are utility animals. So we get French people who feed baguettes, and it's exactly the same. So you've got the exact same situation where they're living on a very high starch diet, and it's baguette, bit of bread roll, and they're living off pasta. And then we also get some of the hunt hounds who are just fed with things from the freezer that they've actually caught in previous hunts. So the hunters will throw in a full, half frozen wild boar, and the dogs have, 99% high protein and fat diet. So we get the same. And then, of course, coming into the shelter, we have to kind of sometimes work out what those habits have been, because we will also get dogs who've been raised in the home and have just eaten scraps and are used to, we get little poodles that come in that are used to eating from a fork and have been hand fed chicken because they've always just eaten bread and pasta. So I think that's absolutely true.
Yeah.
And then at the far end, then we start to say, okay, well, this is a dog food, and then start to say what dog foods are.
Okay, so we see again that it's important to have high quality ingredients. So I remember reading a study that dogs on their own choice would prefer meat over carbs in their intake, and they also prefer human grade food, like human food, over kibbles. And I know there's an industry that says, kibble is what the dog should eat, ignoring 40,000 years of experience that dogs ate from people food tables and leftovers. And so we see that there's a confusion in the science aspect, that who is funding that scientific science aspect of it. So if a food industry wants kibble to be the science important stuff, they would just fund that direction. And if you see like people who are more in the field and actually observe dogs in reality, which is, dogs can make choices, and their primary choices are meat choices, fat choices, and less carb choices. And they also eat vegetables and plants according to their own needs. So we cannot just put the ingredients in one bun and says, this is what dogs eat, because I eat differently than my wife. I eat different than you and Marco, because of your location, because of the weather, because of the environmental factors. That makes a change. Of course, in a stress environment like a shelter, the food intake would be different in the ingredients than a dog who hangs out on the couch and as a couch potato in a home. And it's different if the dog is trying to survive outdoors, because the needs are different. So we have to cover that aspect. A shelter dog that comes from a shelter has different needs for the dog who's being in a foster care, or for the dog who is kind of hanging around doing his business, herding sheep in the wilderness, right? So from that aspect, we go to the next point, the quality of ingredients. And we know this is a huge problem, because there is so much misinformation in the market what a quality ingredient is. So people say, oh, my dog food has chicken in it. And you're like, yay, we have chicken. And my question is, because I used to work in the food industry as a past, my first job actually was transporting chicken from the factory into the slaughterhouse, and from the slaughterhouse into the end user. And trust me, I haven't eaten chicken for years after that. Okay. Now, and these are human grade chickens. At the other time, I also work as a food packaging specialist, system integration, 25 years in the back. So I've seen what food industry uses as ingredients and what pet industry uses as ingredients. They are two completely different worlds. So if you think chicken in the shelf as food for dogs, you're way wrong. It's that it will end up in a landfill for a couple of days, rotted, full of whatever. We don't want to go into details here. We don't want anybody to throw up his coffee, right? And it's not what is shown in this. So we have feed for animals that has different quality than food for humans. And so we push the industry to be more clearly about the ingredients in dog food. What exactly am I putting on my dog food? Where is this food coming from? Am I exporting my garbage overseas? Let it be manufactured there and bring it back to my country and call it, made in USA because it was born in USA? Or am I importing ingredients from whatever outside in the world, and no regulations, no nothing? And then if I do put quality ingredients, who is actually confirming what I put in there? Am I confirming myself? Oh, I'm using always quality ingredients. Well, I never checked it the last 4 years, but I guess I do, right? Looking at Hills, for example, disaster with overdose on vitamin D, where for 4 years were overdosing the dogs, and they were blaming the manufacturer of vitamin D. It's kind of like I'm blaming my dog for the cat's poop, right? So, and I feel we should be very careful. If we feed our dogs, no matter if it's a shelter or person, we should really look into where are these ingredients coming from. Because the last thing I want is hormones in those ingredients. The last thing I want is toxins in those ingredients and chemicals that my dog will not be able to work. And then we have the other part. Then it becomes an unbalanced diet because of lack of those main ingredients, overcooked, overkilled. And remember, what they list on the bag is the quantity and quality before they were processed. So even if I put a healthy chicken into my dog food in my kibble and I cook the poop out of it, it's nothing left for the dog at the end. So if they say minimum amount in the ingredients, minimum analysis, meaning is that's the minimum that is needed to be certified as dog food. Doesn't mean how much it is or how healthy it is. It's just the minimum. Am I feeding minimum or am I feeding maximum? Nobody is here to confirm it. And if you call these companies that says, well, it's business secret. What? How much sugar is in my coffee? I'm sorry, that's business secret. How much water is in my coffee? Sorry, we cannot tell you that because it's business secret. How would I know if I have to? So we have to push those companies to come out with the reality. How much ingredients, where are the screens coming from, this transparency in ingredients. So we're not feeding unbalanced diet. And if you go through those companies and everybody's feeding balanced diet and you compare those balanced diets and you kind of like, wait a minute, what exactly means balanced? Right? How much is balanced diet? How much should a dog really eat from each ingredient? So you see all this variety. Theoretically, if we talk about balanced diet, everybody should have their same values, right? But it's not. So the fish stinks here, right? Now, one thing that I wanted to mention, what is the best feeding location, do you think, for a pet? In the kitchen, in the living room, in the crate, outdoors? What do you guys think?
For me, I think the dog should choose. And so that's a good thing about portable toys is that dog, I mean, as long as I've got a multi-dog house and I need to make sure I manage that so that there's no wars over the food. But when I give my dogs toys, one of mine takes a toy and puts it on my bed, which is utterly disgusting, but she likes to have her food on my bed. And that's where she goes to eat because that's her safe spot. My big male, he goes outside and he takes his con with him and he goes outside, and no matter what the weather is, he lies underneath one of the trees and he eats his food out there. So for me, where dogs can choose and they've got agency in which they can do that, then that's the way forward. But that's not always possible, I know.
Speaking of chewing food on her bed, yep.
Yes, she is. It's a she, it's a he.
It's a she, it's Misha.
Misha, ciao Misha, come stai?
Yeah, bene, molto bene. So Misha, for example, is a classic example of an OCD dog. Things have to be in a certain place. If I would switch balls and that ball is not in the right place, she's like, Houston, we have a problem here, right?
Yeah.
If I change food location or I change food flavor, we have a transition issue. That's not what I was expecting to eat. It's not an expected place to be. So she has hard time eating. So in order for her to switch food or switch location, I have to have a transition period from one place to the other. So when I moved into my RV, that's an RV, by the way. When I moved into the RV, I recreated the old position of their food bowls. And I brought it into my RV in the same location. So if you guys move from one place to the other, use the same concept, having the similar feeding location next to the sink, because it's also the environmental factors that affect the location. Next to a door, next to a window, next to a barking dog, next to a hallway. Some dogs don't feel comfortable in high traffic areas.
Because you've got to be safe, and that's the main thing.
Exactly.
If you're going to eat, you can't have your sympathetic nervous system engaged. You have that got to be safe. That safety is a fundamental thing about eating.
Exactly. And one other factor that I see, Marco, how do you guys feed?
Well, you're talking about the
location.
Well, in terms of location, as you were already mentioning, I believe, I mean, one of the main issues I've been finding when consulting people in regard to dog feeding is the fact that dogs are not left there is not assigned to dog a safe and a quiet location to feed, right? In some cases, it's just under the stairs where people are climbing to go up. So, or next to the restroom door, or next to the sofa, but is also where you go to cross from the kitchen to the living room, right? So, in some cases, that's really an issue, because some dogs may really get nervous because of that, and over time they start to develop some behavioral issues, food related behavioral issues, in many cases anxiety or aggressive behavior, because that situation perpetuates, and over time that anxiety becomes chronicle and escalates and gets to another stage, right?
Absolutely
So
right.
people do not necessarily give the right value to feeding location and how important it is for the dog feel safe and feeling to have the time to eat at her or his own pace, and without any type of disturbance, without any type of friction of event that can bother him or her. That's the golden rule, I would say. Of course, there is so much more to say in this regard, but the golden rule is, for if I have to do, if I have to give just, if I have to provide just one advice to, for example, people that have dog at home and asking where I should put the bowl of my dog, right? Help the dog to understand where, try to see what's the preference of the dog, but make sure that that place is a dog where the dog can eat quietly and without being disturbed by anybody in that moment.
I 100% agree. I do the same thing. I have one dog who prefers to eat in the crate. I have one dog who prefers to eat on his bed, and I have one dog who prefers to eat next to the kitchen. All it comes down the dog's preference. So it's not about me here where my dog is eating. It's about how where the dog feels safe and comfortable. And so the one thing that I always see is a problem with people is lack of water through not enough moistured food. And what happened here is dogs with lack of water, they get stressed. Dogs who have not enough water in their food have hard times working with their brains. The body goes into a dehydration stress, and you know how you guys feel when you get dehydrated. You have hard time driving a car, you have hard time thinking, your decisions are manipulated. And so a dog who doesn't get enough hydration, and I have seen dogs who are thirsty in front of a full bowl of water. Because what happens with water, and I want to point it out, most of you knows that already, but for our audience, is that there's a biofilm happening on the rim of the water bowl. And that biofilm, every time the dog drinks out of it, it closes the surface and basically seals the water, creating in its own environment. So what happens, we have these microbacteria swimming or floating on the surface, causing that water to become a standing water. And standing water dogs avoid because they know that it's unhealthy. So over the period of times, dogs know that flowing water is a healthy water and standing water is an unhealthy water. And of course, if a dog gets thirsty, he has to drink whatever water, but it's a preference. And we see now, why would dogs drink from the toilet bowl? Because usually there is a leak and there is a consistent flow of water. So the toilet bowl is fresher sometimes than the water bowl in the kitchen, unless we clean the water bowl and refresh the water bowl at least twice a day. So from my perspective, when I clean up my dog's bowl, I do it once a day, the slime that sticks in, you can put your finger in it. It's kind of like a lubricant. You cannot even clean it. You have to scrub it away. And so fresh water is important, and especially in shelters where dogs are digging themselves into with his paws and spilling the water. Of course, if you have 40, 50 dogs filling up the waters every day, it's a lot of work, right? And washing all those bowls, you need a huge dishwasher to wash them. So the cleaning is not
We do it by hand.
right. So you have to have this, consistency in having clean water and fresh water. I have water from my sink, which is a well, which I wouldn't drink, and I drink my waters. So I have a special water that get in reverse osmosis, clean water, and I add some minerals to make it more flavorful. But I try to get as healthy water as possible. Healthy water secures the dog's well-being as much as healthy food. Dogs need more water than they need food. They can starve for a couple of days, but they cannot make it a long time without
No,
water. So it's an important
no.
factor. So really appreciate you guys' input. Again, I want to explain to all of you guys that. Oh, we have a comment. Hold on. Amelia, always concerned about the amount of water my dog is drinking. Yeah, there's never enough water. I 100% offer my dogs. I'm lying. Sometimes I miss looking at the water bottles before I leave the house, and I come back and I was like, shit, I forgot the water bottles to water.
So you need a
But
dog that's going to tell you. My Cocker Spaniel would stick her foot in the water bowl and scrape it and make such an horrendous noise that I would know immediately that the water bowl was empty.
So Emma and Marco, I'm so appreciate you guys being here today and sharing your knowledge. And you both are my favorite people to reach out, among others. Sorry, but yeah, if I have a problem, I call up Marco and share, like, Marco, what do you think about that? I have this weird idea about stuff, and like, okay, let me talk about it. And Emma, the same thing. You're done already with your studies at the animal behavior college, right?
Never done. Never finished.
Never finished, always learning. And I so appreciate
Yeah.
you guys for your input. Thank you guys for joining and
Thank you.
watching. Always can ask questions to our board. And let me click that away. The lack of water. And I'm so happy to have you guys here more often. We should talk about stuff. And you guys have any questions and you would like, hey guys, I would like to know more about that or this, okay? That I cannot find any clear answers. We happy to put together a team of specialists and discuss things like we did today in how can feeding your dog cause aggression. Thank you everyone for watching and looking forward to see you soon again.
Thank you, Roman. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Bye, Emma. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.